We're all Americans. Don't do this to your family members and your friends and your neighbors.
This is America. And that was a Californian who's worried about getting caught up on the Trump administration's crackdown on fraud. As the White House looks to get tough on those misusing public money, will legitimate welfare recipients get caught in the crossfire? Or is it a move that's long overdue? I'll have more on that later. But first, to Rob Matheson in our Washington studio.
Thanks, John. Now, welcome to the United States, where the government says the states are united by fraud. Taxpayers are losing billions of dollars. The Trump administration says it needs to stop, so it's launched a wide-ranging anti-fraud task force. As John said, those who back the plan say it should have been done much earlier. They describe the system as riddled with loopholes and negligence, but opponents are worried that people could be shut off from grants and benefits, even if they're entitled to them. And they say the system could be used to target members of political groups or particular sections of society. But there's no doubt it's a big problem. It's not a case of where is it happening, it's more like, well, pick a state.
Now at 5, an Arizona man who made millions off a sober living scheme has been sentenced for his role in the Medicaid fraud.
Just a few hours ago, we found out more than $10 million has been stolen since November.
Tonight, an arrest and answers after the city of Tallahassee lost millions of dollars to a scammer in 2024.
An employee of the Fresno Arts Council stole more than $1 million in Measure P funding.
Esco is now accused of stealing $34 million in COVID-19 relief money.
Here in the Carolinas, the scams apparently cheated taxpayers out of more than $20 million.
The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office recovered more than $11 million in fraud last year.
New here at 5 o'clock, a report on the massive identity theft problem with Illinois unemployment benefits.
So the White House knows it's got a problem.
These are not victimless crimes. Sometimes the most vulnerable people in our community are the ones who suffer when we don't take fraud seriously.
And it thinks it's found the solution.
Indictments, recovered funds, search warrants, raids, seizures, investigations.
Cue the crackdown.
States like California, states like Hawaii, states like New York have completely not taken the fraud issue seriously in the Medicaid program. And so for those states that refuse to get serious about fraud, we are going to turn off that anti-fraud money. And if we continue to find problems, we can turn off other resources within their state Medicaid programs as well.
Okay, we're going to focus on the anti-fraud task force. It's aimed at benefit programs which the Trump administration says are subject to massive levels of fraud. Programs like these. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP as it's known. It helps those on low incomes to pay for groceries. Medicaid, that's medical insurance for people on low wages. Medicare for the elderly and the disabled. Housing support programs. Plus, income support like disability and unemployment benefits. It's also investigating contractors for potential fraud. Millions of Americans get help from those programs, but that's where the Trump administration says the problems lie. Heidi Jo Castro explains how much fraud the U.S. government says it's identified.
Just how much government fraud is occurring in the United States? Is it really a behemoth of a problem as Donald Trump and his supporters claim? Well, the Federal Government Accountability Office, headquartered here, is tasked with crunching those numbers. And in fact, here they are. According to the GAO's most recent fraud risk management report, the U.S. government loses somewhere between $233 to $521 billion to fraud every single year. That comes out to between 3 to 7% of the federal budget. Now, that is a large range because the GAO studied data from both before and during the COVID-19 pandemic when the federal piggy bank overflowed with apparent opportunities for fraudsters. Here's how GAO's director, Rebecca Shea, put it.
There's that joke about, like, why do people rob banks? It's because the money's there, right? And the same thing is true on the incentive side with the federal government. It's trillions of dollars, so a very attractive target.
Among the most prominent recent cases was one involving this Minnesota woman who federal prosecutors say led a fraud scheme that stole roughly $250 million of public money that was supposed to feed hungry children during the pandemic. She's now serving nearly 42 years in prison. Dozens of other people also pled guilty, many of them Somali Americans, attracting the ire of the president, who used the fraud case to justify ICE raids in Minneapolis.
The Somali pirates who ransacked Minnesota remind us that there are large parts of the world where bribery, corruption, and lawlessness are the norm, not the exception. Importing these cultures through unrestricted immigration and open borders brings those problems right here to the USA.
Trump has repeatedly accused Democrats of enabling fraud. His Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, cut billions of dollars in federal contracts across the country. 88% of those cuts targeted Democratic districts. But Republicans have also been tainted, like Rick Scott, who before becoming a U.S. Senator led the nation's largest hospital company that was fined $1.7 billion for defrauding federal health care programs. Scott was never charged with a crime. Republicans say fraud is still a mainly Democratic problem due to weak oversight and encouragement of people to depend on government welfare. Democrats counter that cases of fraud are isolated and should not be used to punish whole populations. The administration insists that fraud on both sides will be punished. As for the American people, polls show they are aware and concerned about government fraud, but few believe that Trump's reforms are improving the problem.
I want to introduce our guest for today. Jessica Riedl is Budget and Tax Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Romina Boccia is Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute. Thank you very much indeed for being with me. Jessica, I'm going to come to you first. With regard to the anti-fraud effort that the administration is putting in, if this is such a big problem, we've been hearing the numbers are, to my mind, astronomical in this. Why has it taken so long to find a solution?
Politicians love to talk about fraud. There's going to be press conferences all the time. Congress hold hearings. I used to staff some of the congressional hearings on waste, fraud, and abuse. It's easy to hold a press conference. It's really hard to combat fraud. There's about $186 billion a year in payment errors lost in the federal budget. But fixing it sometimes requires going through 10,000 different federal programs, looking at different payment systems, eligibility rules, overhauling all of that. Politicians are really good at holding the press conference. They're not as interested in doing all the follow-up to combat waste. And in fact, they've been defunding the waste watchdogs over the last several years.
Romina, we can't, I would imagine, have reached this stage without some effort being made in the past. Previously, who's normally in charge of looking after or combating fraud at this scale?
Well, one of the major issues is that many of the most fraud-prone programs are administered at the state level, but they're funded at the federal level. So you have a misalignment there of incentives because states in many cases would have to expend their own resources in order to fight fraud. But if they have improper payments, federal taxpayers pick up the tab. But who has been traditionally a watchdog for fraud have been the inspector generals working together with Congress. And in many cases, and this is even something that the IRS has been stressing, a lot of the fraud that we're seeing is as a result of bad legislation, where Congress has made it actually difficult for many of these government agencies to identify and fight the fraud without legislative changes. It all ultimately comes back to Congress. The Department of Justice also has a role to play primarily in persecuting those who are convicted of fraud.
Jessica, is it fair to say, just picking up on what Romina was talking about, that there, to some degree, at least perhaps at state level, there is a reluctance to try and deal with this simply because of the complexity involved, but also just the size of the problem?
It's remarkable. Part of it is resources. A lot of states are still running the same unemployment insurance software from the 1970s. So you have terrible waste and unemployment insurance because states don't want to spend the resources, they don't want to spend the money upgrading all of the systems. But in many ways, states are actually driving the waste. Let me give you an example. There's something called the Medicaid provider tax, where states purposely create the illusion that they're spending more on Medicaid than they are so that they can get bigger federal reimbursements, because the federal government reimburses about 2/3 of the cost for a state's Medicaid program. So states actually contribute to the waste, because if they can create the illusion they're spending more money, they can get more, what's essentially fraudulent money from Washington.
It's a racket.
Well, on that basis, I mean, to me as an outsider, the way you're describing it, the problem seems absolutely obvious, as do the causes. And yet we're in the situation now where this anti-fraud agency is having to be put in place, and we are dealing with enormous sums of money. Why is it that I'm just interested in unpicking why this problem has not been addressed at this level before.
Well, in many cases, state legislators like to bring the bacon home. They don't actually want federal funds to dry up. And even federal money that flows into the state that goes to what should be ineligible recipients, or that is perhaps even wasted on fraud, in many cases can still boost state GDP because it's federal money coming into their state. So the incentives are problematic here. You also have a lot of groups at the state level that lobby for these programs. And when you put in place tighter eligibility restrictions that could lead to less funding and fewer beneficiaries receiving those benefits, those groups make themselves hurt and they fight those reforms. So it's very difficult to get even good policy reforms that would attack fraud, abuse, and overspending because of those political incentives.
To build on that, an example would be the pandemic fraud. During the pandemic, we were so focused on getting money out the door, get it out the door as fast as possible, that the federal government put virtually no money into oversight because members of Congress did not want to slow down the money or delay eligible people from getting their funding. So the federal government and Congress are willing to lose a lot of money in fraud if it makes sure that you don't have anyone who's eligible getting delayed. And that's part of the trade-off. If we're going to put in more controls with, say, Medicare reimbursements, it's going to take the federal government longer to even reimburse the eligible people. Members of Congress don't want to hear from angry constituents that they're not getting the benefits they're entitled to because the fraud controls are taking a little bit longer. They want the money out the door.
There's a point that both of you made reference to in the past, and I just want to get an idea of this. You're talking broadly as though this is legislation, this is all to do with Congress and so on. How much is it to do with the system? Is the system broken? Is that where the focus should be as well?
Yeah, the system is broken too. For example, we have this thing called the do not pay system, and most states don't use it. The vast majority of payment errors are as a result of federal agencies not checking data that they actually have access to. So some of that requires training of the employees that are administering the benefits. It might require hiring more of those administrators, or better yet, if you would simplify a lot of these programs and they would be less complex, it could be easier to administer the benefits as well. That comes back to statutory changes that do have an effect on the administrators on the ground.
Yeah, I would add that the political system is broken here because the incentives are all messed up. If I'm a politician, I want to go on TV and talk about the massive amount of waste in Medicare and Medicaid. But if I follow up and do all the work and put in the resources, put in the fraud controls, and Medicaid spending goes down $10 billion next year because of it, I'm not getting any reward at election time. If I run TV ads that I cut $10 billion in waste from Medicare, voters don't care. Voters want to know what benefits they get. It's not worth it for politicians to do the hard work of following up.
I just want to bring us back to a point that it is worth remembering, of course, that not everybody who gets access to the benefits is actually doing it legally. I mean, those who support the administration's effort to fight fraud say that the U.S. benefit system itself is a way of making easy money.
Billions and billions of dollars each year leave our programs into the hands of pirates, fraudsters, scammers, and gangs who treat American generosity as little more than a get-quick-rich scheme.
We heard earlier in our reporter Heidi Jo Castro's package saying, Rebecca Shea, director of the Government Accountability Office, saying, why do people rob banks? Because that's where the money is. That's exactly the analogy that she was using to talk about the benefit system. But I want to talk about the verification system, the front end, if you like, of this whole thing, where people get initially assessed. What's your assessment about where the weaknesses are, Jessica, in that, which means that the the traps, if you like, where potential fraudsters could fall into perhaps don't exist, and that's why they get through?
It happens because there's a rush to get money out the door in a lot of these programs, particularly in Medicaid. They want to sign people up and make sure that no one falls through the cracks of our healthcare system. For SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, they want to make sure people don't fall through the cracks. Members of Congress don't want to hear from angry constituents falling through the cracks. So there is an incentive to sign people up as quickly as possible. And one odd provision we have, say, in Medicaid, is that states are actually limited by the federal government with how often they can confirm a family's eligibility. They can only reconfirm that you're still eligible for Medicaid, that your income hasn't rose too high a couple times a year. And if they actually check eligibility too much, the federal government will punish them. This doesn't make any sense. It's because the priority is getting the money out the door, and they would rather overpay than underpay.
There's also technical components. For example, one of the biggest fraud opportunities in the food stamp program is the fact that the EBT cards, the electronic benefit cards, don't have chips implemented in them. And only 9 states have adopted even that very simple fraud protection that makes it harder for so-called card skimming to occur. So a lot of it is also states not making the investments to prevent against very easy, low-hanging fruit fraud, because it would require financial expenditures on the state level when the fraudulent payments don't affect the state budget.
I just want to talk also about the impact on people who are doing this legitimately in the face of the fraud. I mean, the administration says this is all about catching people who are deliberately defrauding the government, but the methods are casting a wide net. And as anybody who goes fishing knows, that means you could end up catching things that you shouldn't. John Hendren explains.
Christy Madden doesn't want to become an innocent casualty of the Trump administration's war on healthcare fraud.
I'm very concerned. Every person I know who's disabled, and I represent the disability community as an advocate, is super concerned.
The administration is withholding more than $1 billion from California over allegations of fraud.
You have to appreciate that this fraud issue is fundamentally theft from the taxpayer, but also theft from people who need these programs.
Madden's worry? When the Trump administration seeks to corral those who misspend public money, it can cast a wide net.
We're going to hurt the people that benefit from the program to make sure that these few people that are committing fraud don't, get to take things illegally. I mean, why not go after them? Why go after the whole community?
In California, Dr. Mehmet Oz, head of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, blames Los Angeles' large Armenian community.
Roughly $3.5 billion of fraud taking place here in Los Angeles in hospice and home care. It's run quite a bit of it by the Russian Armenian mafia. You notice the lettering and language behind me is of that dialect.
The building behind him, a bakery, says it's lost business and does not provide medical services. Critics note that Trump has targeted 2 states with Democratic governors. Now the U.S. Department of Justice has launched a crackdown called Operation Never Say Die, charging more than a dozen people with over $60 million in fraudulent billings to the federal government for hospice service for the dying. The administration has temporarily banned new providers of hospice services, which the state had already banned as part of its own anti-fraud enforcement. We spoke to a hospice provider who said here in California and elsewhere, the allegations of fraud are not baseless. And he said good actors, like himself, have an obligation to ensure that bad actors are discovered.
There's a problem when patients are being hurt, of course.
Kevin Tatunjian says integrity problems take many forms.
Enrolling beneficiaries without their knowledge. So that is the most blatant type of fraud. Clear fraud. I think the second is enrolling beneficiaries with them understanding, but not really fully understanding what hospice involves. And then there is enrolling beneficiaries and providing poor or inadequate care.
Christy Madden fears the federal crackdown could harm those who need and deserve the help most.
We're all Americans. Don't do this to your family members and your friends and your neighbors. This is what keeps us living in happy lives. Don't destroy our communities.
As that federal crackdown continues, So does a political standoff between the U.S. government and the state of California. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Los Angeles.
And Romina, that's an example of what we were starting to talk about. The fact that yes, people may be carrying out fraud in the system. Somebody's got to pay for that, and there's going to be a downside. And the example that John was just giving in his report there, just talk us through the kind of impact this does have on people who are legitimately claiming benefits.
Well, to the degree that these are open-ended entitlements like Medicaid and food stamps, for example, that federal taxpayer is the first who's affected because it increases the national debt, drives up deficits. That has implications for economic growth. But in terms of the beneficiaries that are legitimately entitled to receiving benefits, a lot of the fraud-fighting measures can increase the hurdles that they too will face, whether it's more frequent recertifications, having to fill out more paperwork or reapply in some cases, where legitimate beneficiaries also get caught up in it. But unless you do that fraud fighting, you are also undermining legitimacy in the welfare system, which in the long term can hurt those people who rely and depend on benefits.
Jessica, one of the points that John was making also in his report is that the states that are being targeted appear to be predominantly Democrat. Now, there is that worry, isn't there, that as soon as the federal government gets involved in anything, something could become politicized. Is there a concern that that may happen, and are there checks and balances that you could see that would stop Democrat states, for example, under this administration, being targeted more than Republicans? Although the administration, it should be made clear, has said everybody's going to be affected by this.
I'm concerned because this undermines the legitimacy of the anti-waste and anti-fraud crackdown. I think we absolutely need to go after fraud. It's the low-hanging fruit. The more fraud we eliminate from the federal budget deficit, the less we have to cut from the programs we care about. But it's hard to ignore the fact that the federal government is going after blue states. It's hard to ignore that virtually every example of fraud that the administration goes after is perpetrated by an undocumented immigrant. They don't seem to be going after fraud in red states. They don't seem to be going after fraud perpetrated by American citizens. Nor do they seem to be going after areas like defense contract overruns and defense fraud, which would hit a little more of the conservative constituency. I think we need a war on waste, but I think there's waste to be found everywhere, and you undermine your political aims and political legitimacy when you look like you're singling out political opponents.
One of the other issues, of course, is that we were talking about the structure of the system itself, and I understand that a lot of it is digitized, a lot of it is not. And in the event that you bring the federal government into systems like this, is there a concern that that is going to give the government more access to people's private details? I mean, is there a system that Chinese walls, as it's normally called, to try to separate these elements and keep them apart?
Yeah, data access is a key element of making sure that the people who are receiving benefits are truly eligible, because many of these programs have so-called asset tests. And that means that the government needs to be able to verify what the account value is in your savings accounts and potentially other investments that you might have. And so inevitably, if you are applying for federal government benefits that have those means and asset tests, you're looking at sharing more of your data with the government as a condition of receipt of those benefits.
Jessica, what's your view on that?
I think ultimately people are going to have to surrender a little bit of privacy if you want federal assistance. I think that's part of the reality of it. That's part of the fraud control. There is no view that everybody is necessarily automatically entitled to federal assistance, even if you're not willing to verify your eligibility. That being said, there is hope we can streamline some of this. AI, for instance, might be a tool that can better streamline these processes, make them done more quickly. I understand the privacy concerns, but I think if you're receiving tax dollars, you need to accept some of that.
Romina, in terms of somebody who has been receiving benefits and then decides, no, I don't need these anymore, and then goes back to the agency, says, no, you can cut these off now, but as does happen, continues to get paid despite their efforts to hand the cash back. What are the risks, do you think, that they might get caught up in this net that's investigating potential fraud, that they might end up being prosecuted?
Well, what happens more often is that people start earning more. Perhaps they're doing gig work where earnings are volatile, and they end up actually earning more than they're allowed to in order to keep receiving these benefits, and that it doesn't get found until after the fact, and then they're being asked to repay that money. But the question is, did they save it? Do they have it available? The federal government has a really hard time recouping so-called overpayments. Of overpayments, on average, they recoup about 15%, and 85% are just lost forever.
Jessica, I just want to get your thoughts. Do you think that this system is actually going to work, this anti-fraud system?
Which
well, the crackdown that is being brought in by the administration.
I'm skeptical because I've seen the example from Doge. Doge originally came in promising to cut $2 trillion, $1 trillion in waste, fraud, and abuse. It really just ended up being theater. They didn't go after the real waste that what we're talking about. They went after political totems that excited the MAGA base. DEI contracts, funding for AIDS in Africa, government employees, and they ended up cutting virtually nothing because it was really just a political show. So the burden of proof is, can they do better?
We're going to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed. I want to say thanks to our guest, Jessica Riedl, Budget and Tax Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Romina Boccia, the Director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute. And that's all from the team here in Washington. I'm going to hand you back to John Hendren and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. Don't forget, of course, we are on the web, aljazeera.com. Bye for now.
On the next edition of This Is America, the tension between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. How much leverage does the U.S. president have over the leader of Israel? And is the rift threatening to derail negotiations between the United States and Iran? That's Thursday at 18:30 GMT or 11:30 a.m. if you're here on the Pacific coast of the United States. Until then, from the whole team, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.